Boldwood presents Coffee and Cake at Wildflower Lock. Written by Hannah Lynn and read by Rosalind Steele. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Daisy May looked at the keys in her hand. This was it. Any second now, she would post them back through the letterbox of the flat where she had lived for the last 2 years and mark the end of that chapter of her life. Not that she had any choice. The hike in rent and involuntary redundancy made it impossible to stay. Fortunately, those two events had coincided with an entirely unexpected inheritance. When Daisy had first learned she was the owner of the September Rose, a wide-beam canal boat moored at the picturesque Wildflower Lock, her mind had turned giddy with the images of a beautifully painted vessel with a picture-perfect interior, complete with a wood-burning stove. Never envisioning herself on the water, she had also assumed that a quick sale of the aforementioned imagined boat would leave her with a healthy deposit for a house of her own. Her assumptions were wrong. While a wood-burning stove did stand in one corner of the living space, hidden behind crumbling cardboard boxes, that was where the similarities between her vision and the real September Rose ended. From a grime-filled water tank to a hull that hadn't been tended to in years, the boat was in need of some serious TLC. Daisy's plans had pivoted when she decided to renovate the houseboat herself before she sold it. Only, the more time she spent on the September Rose, and the more she learned about her family's history on the waterways, the less she wanted to be separated from it. And now, be it serendipity or simply good timing, selling wasn't an option. Instead, she was going to have to live in it full time. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, spurring her to slip the keys through the letterbox before answering the call. "Hey, Mum, is everything okay?" "Fine, just checking you were all okay. What time are you leaving the flat?" "I'm outside the front door, leaving now." "Good, good." Her mother had a restlessness in her voice, and Daisy envisioned her holding the phone between her ear and shoulder as she hurried about the house, trying to keep things straight the way she did when she was worried about something. "You don't want to be hanging around for long. You want to get an early night. You've got a big day tomorrow." Daisy bit her tongue. After all the preparation, she was hardly going to forget the significance of the next day. Tomorrow morning was opening day at the coffee shop on the canal. The coffee shop was going to be the answer to all Daisy's problems. While she owned the September Rose outright, boats still came with all sorts of costs, like mooring fees and electricity bills. She needed a new job, and preferably one that didn't involve too much travelling. At the same time, Wildflower Lock desperately needed a place where all the dog walkers and paddleboarders could grab themselves a cup of coffee. And so, a little over 3 weeks ago, she had got to work renovating a small area of the boat into a takeaway coffee shop. It had been non-stop, using every daylight hour to make sure it was properly fitted out. And now the time was almost ready to open up the hatch and start serving customers. "Don't worry, Mum, I'm heading back now." "Good, good. OK, darling, I'll see you soon." As she hung up the phone, Daisy took one more step back onto the pavement and placed her hand on the front door of the flat. It was strange to grow so attached to nothing more than bricks and mortar, but she had made memories in this home. Good memories. But now it was time she moved on. As she drove away from London toward Wildflower Lock, Daisy considered her to-do list for the following day, like writing out a price list on a chalkboard and checking that she had enough change for a float. Despite her mother's love of food and lifelong career as a chef, it had never been Daisy's dream to run a coffee shop. But since the idea had struck, she felt, for the first time she could remember, that she had found a role in life into which she could truly see herself settling. The car journey was swift. After parking up, Daisy stepped outside and breathed in. It wasn't hard to see how the lock had got its name. All along the towpath, the hedgerows were alive with colour, from the whites of cow parsley to the yellows of buttercups and the soft pinks of dog roses. And every day it changed. A covering of clouds could transform the tones of the water from vibrant blue to the darkest of greys, while swans and herons and all other forms of waterfowl made the waterway a hive of activity. And that was before you considered the people. "Afternoon!" Daisy raised her hand to a dog walker who was making their way through the gate. "Afternoon!" A few metres later, she greeted one of the paddle boarders out today. "Have a good evening." "You too." The people who visited the lock were some of the friendliest Daisy had encountered. Every day she would find herself embroiled in a conversation with someone, from canal volunteers to hikers who wanted to tell her all about their day, and though the walk from the car park to the September Rose was only a couple of 100 feet, sometimes it could take as much as half an hour to make the distance. But despite the friendliness of the visitors, the same could not be said for the people who lived on the water. At least, not all of them. "Afternoon!" Daisy raised her hand to a man standing on the back of his boat. Given how close he lived to the towpath entrance, and the fact that his boat roof was covered with plants which needed constant attention, Daisy saw this gentleman at least twice a day, if not more. And yet, so far, despite trying her hardest, she had not managed a single conversation with him. "Your begonias are looking beautiful," she added, hoping today might be the day. With a small grunt, he ducked his head back down and continued to water his plants. "Nice to see you too," she muttered under her breath. As excited as Daisy was for her upcoming life on Wildflower Lock, it was proving harder to find her place amongst the long-time boat owners than she'd expected. It probably didn't help that until 3 months ago, she hadn't known the first thing about living on the water. She hadn't known the difference between a pump-out or a cassette toilet, or why you needed to get hulls blacked, or even what a tiller was. The learning curve had been steep, and she was getting there, but obviously not quick enough to make good with all the locals. Currently, one of the only boat owners who would greet her with more than a passing hello was Yvonne, an elderly lady who owned a beautifully painted boat called the Ariadne, which was moored on the other side of the canal. Yvonne had the dress sense of a 70s Vogue model, and every time Daisy caught sight of her, standing on the boat with her purple ombre hair, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for this lady with a penchant for crystals and incense sticks. She was one of the longest-standing residents of Wildflower Lock, and had lived on this stretch of the canal so long she'd been there back when Daisy's father first bought the September Rose. It was Yvonne who told Daisy about her past, or at least pieces of it. The rest she had insisted Daisy heard from her mother, something they were still working through. The other person who Daisy would regularly spend time with was her neighbour, Theo. Theo was the first resident Daisy had met on the lock. Rather than the standard introduction you would expect, she had walked in on him naked in his home, though, in her defence, it was her first time on the canal and she'd thought it was her boat she was on. Needless to say, he had been less than impressed. Yet the pair had worked through their rocky start and formed a solid friendship, which had almost progressed to something more. Right now, they were still at the just good friends stage, and Daisy was perfectly fine with that. It had been several years since her last relationship, but the emotional scars had only just healed, and the last thing she wanted to do was open them all up again by rushing into something, no matter how much her friends tried to badger her. Sensing that today might not be the day to strike up a conversation with any more locals,